All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you. Welcome, everyone. We thank you for joining us today for a panel discussion on practical solutions to adapt research and evaluation plans during COVID-19. We are so overjoyed to see how much interest there is in our topic, and we're really excited to have this rich conversation with you all today. So thank you so much for joining. We have a few logistics, which I'm actually going to change on the spot because our meeting didn't work out quite the way we thought it would. Gotta love technology. You guys all have access to your videos and your audio, so make sure that you mute those audios so that we can kind of focus in on the presenter that's speaking while we talk. We'll be using the chat function today that you see. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a chat function. So feel free to write in any comments, introduce yourself, share any resources that you have available that you think would be beneficial to everyone listening in, and make sure to write your questions there. As Allison mentioned, we'll be kind of going through all of those questions and kind of grouping them together as we go so that we can have hopefully address all of the conversations and all of the points that you all are raising during our time together. The presentation that we've designed is really highlights some key lessons learned that we're kind of seeing in our work with youth organizations so far, and also builds off of all the questions and information that you have shared during the registration process. But we'll definitely expand on each of those talking points through our conversation. So hopefully you'll get some good takeaways from the slides, but also get some additional information and expansion in the conversation that we have that follows. We set up some dedicated time kind of after each topic to pause and reflect on the questions. So we'll come back to those questions and kind of regroup on them and multiple times throughout the conversation. So please feel free to write in those questions as we go and just kind of keep adding to that list. And then just to let you all know, we are recording this conversation. Yep, and just double checked. We are recording this conversation, and we'll make sure that we make that available to you all. So here within the next week, we'll be sending out all of those resources, including the recording, including the slides, as well as any other resources that we've used and things that you have shared during the conversation, and that will be coming out to you in about a week. So keep an eye on your email for that. I am thrilled to have three exceptional panelists joining me here today, all with years of experience kind of leading and supporting research and evaluation efforts with youth development programs. Between us, we are ready to answer all of your questions and excited to learn from you and the work that you're doing. But hopefully with this kind of panel here today, we should be able to kind of have really rich conversations around research and evaluation priorities, design decisions, methodologies that you're using, communicating with different stakeholders, and I'm sure dozens of other topics that are going to come up throughout our conversation. So I'm excited to partner with Ashley, Allison, and Neil, and I think together we've put some really good talking points together that we hope will be really useful to the work that you're doing. I want to go ahead and thank everyone who submitted some of those initial questions during the registration process. We actually received over 500 questions that we have been kind of sifting through over the past couple of weeks to make sense of kind of what your priorities are, what are some of the challenges that you're facing. And I will say there was a lot of head nods as we went through those of just kind of different similar challenges that we're all wrestling with in our work too. So thank you for sharing all of that information. I think we were able to kind of collapse all of that into 4 big themes that we're kind of going to organize our conversation around today. And so we're going to kick it off with Ashley and Neil, who are going to lead our first 2 topics, kind of reviewing some of those immediate reactions, those needs and questions that kind of came top of mind when our programs sort of initially closed, and that we needed to pivot. Then we'll pause there to kind of answer some questions that have come up, kind of see what other conversations have been sparked from those talking points. And then Allison and myself will pick up from there to talk about the different priorities and strategies that are emerging to sort of guide next steps moving forward. And so then again, we'll pause, we'll kind of reflect on some questions that might be specific to that pivot point, and then just kind of open it up to more general questions that have emerged, and other sort of resources or experiences that you are all finding in your work in your communities. So without any further delay, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Ashley Halverstadt. She's the Senior Evaluation and Learning Officer with the SD Bechtel Junior Foundation, and she's going to be talking with us more about meeting the moment.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining you. It's such great to see such a great turnout. And I just want to say a huge thanks to Krista, who has done really all of the heavy lifting to make this session possible. As she said, I'm Ashley. I'm the Senior Evaluation and Learning Officer at the SD Bechtel Junior Foundation, coming to you from my bedroom in Oakland, California. And I'm going to start by just sharing some high-level reflections on, how I think we can find our way forward in this moment as evaluation professionals, as well as a few thoughts on how to bring your funders along, knowing that that's of particular concern to some of you. A slide, please. So we wanted to start really with just a simple and heartfelt message of reassurance in this moment, and encouragement for us all to give ourselves permission to breathe. This is an incredibly stressful time. We know there's a lot of anxiety out there about the state of research and evaluation work, and a lot of pressure to really adapt quickly. And it's our natural tendency in a moment like this to try to look for answers and bring some structure or logic to our environment so we can feel like we're in control. And the reality is there are no quick answers. We certainly don't have all the answers as panelists. This isn't a best practices webinar. This is obviously a time of extraordinary ambiguity. And I think we all just have to give ourselves permission to breathe and take a step back, and give ourselves space to reflect on our priorities in this moment. Everyone's work has been disrupted. Everyone's data set is going to be a complete mess, and that's okay. So as you take a breath and before you make any decisions, next slide, please. We want to encourage you to really revisit your purpose and use case for evaluation. So it's tempting to just start troubleshooting and asking, how am I going to get this evaluation done? What methods am I going to use? What analytical techniques am I going to use? It's harder, but I think a lot more important to ask the big picture questions. Why am I doing this evaluation? Who and what is it for? And the hard reality is that some of the things that felt really compelling a few months ago may not hold as much value now, and we may have to reimagine our purpose in this moment. So really take the time to step back and reestablish shared priorities with all of your partners. Some questions you might think about. Someone the other day told me to think about the WIN principle. What's important now? So what information do we need to support decision-making right now? And as we look ahead and we think about, say, the next 12 or 18 months, what information do we think we might need to support decision-making in that time? Acknowledging that we don't, we probably don't even know yet what information we're going to need. It's all best guesses at this point. But really trying to find those opportunities where we think research and evaluation can be of service and add value in this moment. We think it's a time to revisit our original goals, research questions, our theory of change, our assumptions, and ask whether they hold up in this new reality, and be prepared that they might not. And above all, I think really important to stay focused on use. Who is going to use the information we gather and how? With limited time and resources, we have to prioritize. So if there is no strong use case, it's probably a sign to stop or pivot. Next slide, please. So once we've taken the time to reflect on who and what we want our work to be in service of, we have to take stock of everything on our plates and determine what to do with it. And I thought that this framework from the Center for Community Investment, which I adapted here, was just a really helpful sort of organizing frame. It might make sense to continue some of your work as planned or with modifications for the virtual environment. There might be some work you need to pause or postpone. I would say be really careful with anything you put in this category, because there's no way to know at this stage how long you're going to have to postpone for, when you'll be able to restart the work, and whether it will still be relevant and possible at that time. We might need to pivot and start doing something completely different, because the moment calls for new priorities, emerging priorities. Painful as it could be, there's going to be some work that we just have to honor and let go of because it's no longer relevant or possible. And then in some cases, we might not even have enough information to decide where to put something. And all of these options are okay. And I think the important thing is just to let your guiding purpose and your use case help guide your decisions about what to put where. Slide, please. Now, as you revisit your purpose and priorities, we also really want to encourage folks to keep equity front and center during this time. One of my fears is that there's a risk here that I think the equity lens we bring to our work could be sidelined in this moment, because it's sometimes treated as a nice to have rather than a must have. And there's this idea that it's deep long-term work, and it's tempting to think, well, I don't have time to think about that right now. But we know, of course, that bringing an equity analysis is more critical now than it has ever been. It's been clear to us all, the way this crisis has just laid bare all the social and economic injustices in our society that we already knew were there. And when we fail to bring an equity lens to our research, at best, we're working from partial truths. And at worst, we risk perpetuating or exacerbating the very inequities we hope to solve. So I would really encourage you to keep this top of mind. Ask questions like, who is most impacted in our service population? How can we center their experience in our response? Who gets to decide what's relevant and useful in this moment as you think about purpose and use case? And how can we shift power to those who are most impacted? And how can we broaden and deepen our definitions of validity and rigor in a time like this? Something that personally I think is long overdue anyway, to help us understand the complexity of this situation and understand it in more nuanced ways. Next, please. And finally here, just a word on navigating this moment with your funders. If your research or evaluation project is grant funded, you might be anxious about talking to your funders. You might think it's not possible to revisit your purpose and priorities, that you're just going to have to meet those grant or contract deliverables. But I'll tell you that from where I sit in a foundation right now, I think everything is on the table. So I would just really strongly encourage you to be proactive and transparent with funders and ask for what you need. I've spent years on both sides of the nonprofit and funder relationship. I know the power dynamic is real and it's very hard to be transparent. But when we let that power dynamic govern our behavior, I think that's when we make bad decisions. So when nonprofits make assumptions about what funders want, when it comes to evaluation and then play into those, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when funders make assumptions about what nonprofits need, we're usually wrong because we're not close enough to the work to know. So none of us are mind readers, and we can only be good partners if we're honest with one another about what we need. So talk to your funders early and openly about the challenges you're facing and how you might want to shift. I would say that in general, funders are going to be a lot more flexible and supportive than you might think. remember that at the end of the day, these organizations are made up of people and they care about you, they believe in your work, or they wouldn't be funding it. And I'm seeing a huge movement in philanthropy right now to increase flexibility. Again, something that's long overdue and that I really hope is going to continue beyond this crisis. But foundations are streamlining, delaying, eliminating reporting requirements. Some are converting project grants to general operating grants. So there are a lot of options on the table that you might not be aware of. And in general, I think nonprofits have a lot more agency with funders than they think. We tend to really underestimate how much influence they can have when they come with a well-reasoned explanation of where they want to go and why, and are just really direct in asking for what they need. And if all else fails and you have a bad actor, a funder who's not supportive or flexible, I would say be really clear with them about what their demands are going to cost in terms of time and resources, and make sure they understand what they're asking you to sacrifice in order to meet their requirements. And if you have multiple funders and some of them are more supportive than others, one trick you might try is to ask the supportive funders to do some peer advocacy on your behalf. It's something that happens behind the scenes all the time, and it can be a really effective strategy. But my sincere hope is that if you take the time to determine what's relevant and useful, especially for those most impacted by this crisis, and you share that with your funders, that they're going to get behind you in however you want to move forward. So I'll leave it there for now. We'll have lots of time for questions in a bit. But for now, I'll turn it to my colleague, Neil, to share some thoughts on what you can do to keep your work in motion and make the most of the data and resources you have.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was fantastic. Thank you, everyone who has joined today. I am appreciative to have this opportunity to talk with you about a very important topic around how we deal with data in this unprecedented time. My name is Neil Nofsker, and I work as a principal researcher at the American Institute for Research. Most of my work really the last 17 years has been doing research and evaluation programs in the field of after school, specifically in relation to the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program. I'm going to start off today by starting from the perspective that a lot of you who are on the phone are either research and evaluators that have access to data, or you're a project person who is connected to an evaluation. So I'm going to start my comments there. Next slide, please. Okay, so the theory is that a lot of people on the phone today are in a position where they had plans to collect data this spring, for example, and that opportunity has been lost given the crisis, and you find yourself in a position where you're trying to find ways to move the research and evaluation agenda forward in a way that's meaningful. And one way to potentially do that is to take a look at the data that you may have had collected over the course of the past several years. I know many folks on the phone participating today have had an evaluation, have been working for several years to collect that information. Now might be an opportunity to revisit that information and to look especially for trends or connections that might help inform the future. So for example, many folks on the phone are here because they have some connection to the youth program quality assessment and have been collecting YPQA data over a series of years to drive the improvement of program quality. Now might be a good time to go back and take a look at those data over the course of the past several years and to see what kind of trends you might be seeing. Where have you seen sustained improvement? What types of practices have you been adopting and performing well at over time? Where have there been opportunities for growth that really haven't been realized? I think what's important at this point in time is to take a look at that historical data and to potentially ask the question, are there things that we might need to elevate now because of the needs of students that are going to result from COVID-19. There may be practices that are embedded in the PQA, supports and opportunities that are provided, that are identified in that tool, that might be more important in the future. And going back and looking at the past and getting a sense of how well you've adopted those or programs have adopted those might be a good use of time. In addition to that, it may be a good time too to also see if you can take data that you've collected in the past and potentially connect it in ways that maybe you haven't previously. So maybe there's an opportunity to collect quality data or take the quality data that's been collected and see if you can connect it to data on youth experiences from a survey you've administered in the past, or connect it to data about student participation in the program. And do you see that relationship between more participation and positive youth outcomes? Those types of analyses might be really important to helping document what that sequence of events has been in the past that has led to success. What have been those ingredients in your program that have led to youth having positive experiences, that have led to sustained participation and have led to outcomes? And by looking at that data now, you might be able to explore how some of those change in your success model may now be disrupted by COVID-19, and help engage in discussions with programs around how they might need to pivot or think about programming differently. So I think one way to address our concerns about disrupted data is to potentially go back to data we already have in hand and see if we can make some new meaning from that. Next slide, please. We also know it's very likely as we move into the future that we'll have to make some shifts in how we go about the process of collecting data. And we know first and foremost that in the future, engaging in practices that allow us to obtain information from a distance are likely to be more important. And later in this presentation, I know Krista in particular and also Allison may get into some of those in a more detailed fashion, how we collect data from a distance. Using surveys, of course, I think are going to be increasingly important, especially potentially on mobile devices. Telephone interviews are potentially an avenue that might warrant additional collection or use in the future. It allows to make that personal connections with programs that really understand what they're experiencing, while also getting some valuable data that we might need to move things ahead. And I think increased reliance on extant documents and administrative data are places where we want to potentially try to rely on more heavily in the future, given less direct access to programs and to try to make meaning from them. It's really important as we move ahead is that we think about what our priorities are. Ashley talked about that. I know some people may have research and evaluation plans that are very comprehensive, studying various components, both of implementation and outcomes. But I think we need to think about moving to a place in this new reality where we reduce what we're trying to collect to really those things and from those populations that are especially critical. What are the mission critical pieces of information we really need to have? And how can we make sure that we not only obtain that information by honoring the really, I think, decreased bandwidth programs are going to have in order to collect data. One of the things Ashley pointed out was this issue of relevance. That is if our evaluation questions aren't quite as relevant as they once were, either because data isn't available or the situation has changed, we may have to think about how we go about our sampling process differently. And I think we have to think about potentially more open-ended ways of collecting data. So for example, evaluators often talk about the concept of snowball sampling, where if we're trying to answer a question, we may talk to some people initially and use that information to determine who we want to talk to or interview next, or what lines of inquiry we might want to approach. We may have to be more open and use approaches like snowball sampling in the future in order to engage in the type of data collection to make sure it stays relevant to what's happening in programs currently. If you find yourself in a situation too with a study that you have underway or evaluation activities you have underway, and you know you just need some mission critical data, and there's widespread agreement that the research questions that you are trying to answer are still relevant, it may make sense to consider offering incentives to people you have to collect data from. One of the assumptions I know we're making here at AIR in our own research and evaluation activities is that people are going to be pressed for time and potentially in the future as they try to plan and deliver programming in this new reality. And they may not be as accessible as they normally are. In order to kind of honor that, incentives may be a good way to do that. Now, you definitely want to check with your funding agency to make sure that offering incentives is a viable option. You want to make sure that all the key system actors are aware, and if they have policy on the offering of incentives, that you honor those as well. So it's not something you do lightly. You want to make sure you do it in an ethical fashion. A lot of that involves communication and informed consent around offering incentives, but it may be a strategy in order to get some of the data that's really mission critical. And then finally, as you move into any type of data collection, it's really important that your key partners understand what data collection is taking place, that they have the opportunity to weigh in on its viability and feasibility. And we just have to be more cautious, I think, in this new reality to honor the challenging circumstances that we find ourselves in. Next slide, please. Many of us, including many of the projects that I work on and manage, are suffering from the likelihood of missing data. And for anybody who's currently working on a research and evaluation project, it's relatively inevitable that that's going to happen during the course of the new reality. And so I think some of the things that we've been talking about here at AIR to try to address missing data fall within a couple of categories. First is there a way to take some of our research and evaluation questions and make them more longitudinal in nature, which means that we don't necessarily need to get that data now, but maybe a year or 2 years from now, maybe we can get the outcome data that we need to try to answer our questions and questions. So can we put off some of those examination of data into the future? If you have partial data, you want to spend some time definitely examining what data you have and what may be missing. So is there a systematic pattern to the data you're missing, or is it more random? And if it is more random, you might be in a position where it might be more viable to actually make use of that data now, even though it's only partial in nature. You might be able to engage in some imputation strategies, but you definitely want to have access to those statistical resources if you plan to do that in order to make sure you do that well. If you have pre-data and no post-data, which some of us have, I know many of our projects fall within that camp as well, there's a need to kind of change our lens and think about how we use that pre-data differently, mostly as trying to use it as a way to inform continuous improvement efforts, or to explore how that pre-data may be connected to other sources of data that maybe we haven't looked at before. So how does our pre-data connect to issues of how students are enrolled in programming or their level of attendance, retention, and engagement? So thinking about how that pre-data can be used in different ways as opposed in a normal pre-post data situation. We also know that there's going to be some new opportunities that are likely to emerge as well from COVID-19. That data that previously wasn't necessarily available will be available now. One thing that we know is very likely to happen is that school districts are going to be doing a lot more assessment in the fall in order to better document the learning loss that students experienced. And so there's going to be data, I think a lot more data available on where youth are performing academically that wasn't previously available, that may open up some new opportunities, either potentially using it as post data in an evaluation that's coming to a close, or using it to examine pre-post changes and learning outcomes during the course of the school year in a way that previously wasn't possible. Also, there's a need to plan for the possibility of disruptions in the future. I know here at AIR, we're thinking about how we can collect more frequent data potentially in the future on a smaller scale. So trying to focus on those things that are more immediate in terms of youth experiences and program. What does engagement look like in a shorter time frame? And then focusing more on some of those more immediate outcomes, like are students developing new interests? Are they making new friendships? Things that are critically important for child development and youth development, but maybe sometimes we're not focused on in the past because people were more interested, or stakeholders were more interested in those longer term outcomes. And so trying to focus on those things as well. Next slide, please. And then finally, I want to advocate for us being creative in terms of how we think about disseminating our results to broader audiences. After school and youth development programs, at times in the past, have really struggled to demonstrate their value, unfortunately. And I think there will be an ongoing need to talk about how after school and youth development programs are pivoting during this crisis to meet the evolving needs of youth and supporting the systems they work with, especially schools. And so we really need to be thinking about how best to tell that story, and use this as an opportunity to also think about innovative ways around dissemination, moving beyond just maybe the typical evaluation and research reports we put together, to thinking about things like videos highlighting findings and things like data journalism, which kind of blend the reporting of information with more journalistic ways of reporting information in a way that will reach a broader audience. I really do think this is a unique time for our field in terms of being able to demonstrate both our flexibility and ability to pivot when we need to address family needs. And I think there's a critically important story that's going to need to be told there that I think will enhance the perceptions of our field and the value we bring to the table in supporting youth development. So I think we'll pause at the moment, and I think we're going to take some questions now before we move into the next segments.
Yes, I just wanted to jump in quickly and acknowledge a few of the questions that have come up during the chat so far. So for those of you that joined us a few minutes late, we will be sharing the slides out in about a week. We'll be creating a resource page where the recording of the webinar, as well as all the slides, will be posted, and any additional resources that you share in the chat box, as well as resources that we've been combing through the past few weeks, few months to kind of understand what our decisions are moving forward. So know that those will be coming to you here in the next week. Allison, I know you've been taking a look at the chat. I was curious if you saw any themes that were popping up in some of those questions.
Sure, I'm happy to just spend a minute or two. So it sounds like a lot of people are interested to learn more about virtual data collection, which Krista is going to do a fabulous job describing in some detail. So I'm going to skip over some of those questions that are coming up. I think there was a great question while Neil was talking about to what extent do the trends still hold in our new normal, and how do you apply, or is it relevant to still use findings from past work to current work or future work? And Neil, I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
No, I think it's a great question. And I think the past results, I think, are useful for a couple of reasons, potentially. One, not that it's going to be completely representative of what we see in the future, but I think it is an opportunity to go back and to see where we've been, and to highlight where there has been both successes in quality, supporting youth development, further refining and understanding what the connections are in terms of that sequence of events that youth go through in terms of how they benefit, and going through an exercise of not only looking at where we see those connections, but also what does that mean for the types of disruptions we're likely to experience. I think it's an opportunity to look for and anticipate where things might break down under COVID-19 because of the changes in the learning environment, that programs can potentially think about how do we proactively address that? Or is that connection even what we should be focusing on now? So I think it is an opportunity to kind of systematically look at your theory of change, look at the documented evidence to support that change happens in the way you thought it happens in the past, and what might be different in the future because of the changes both in the context in which students live and are learning, and also their accessibility to these resources. And so I do think there is some value in terms of looking at the past to inform what we might need to anticipate in the future relative to how we design and deliver programs.
That's great. That's wonderful. Krista, I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to move on to you just to make sure we have enough time. One of the other questions that came up is, Neil, I think you talked about this a little bit, but maybe a little bit more. Any tips or adaptations to make extrapolations well with what you currently have, disruptive data you have?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a substantive issue, right? Around what can we do with the data that's characterized by missing data. And I do think there is this I think you have to go through a series of steps, to be honest. And one of them is to understand your degree of missingness, first of all, and to try to get a sense of how random or systematic that is. And if you have systematic missing data where there's just certain populations that are completely absent from your data, you have to wrestle with what that means. And does it mean that you cannot really make any meaning out of the data because you're just missing some key elements and it's going to be biased as a consequence of that? Can you go forward with the analyses that you're undertaking and still have something meaningful to say? And then there's the imputation strategies, which take us into the statistical realm, which I think which may warrant examination, but I think want to be used very cautiously and make sure you have access to the resources in terms of experts to help you make really good decisions in that regard. So I don't know if there's a whole lot else to say without getting into a lot of really details at the moment, but I think that's what I would advocate for at the moment.
That's great. Krista, lots of questions about what you're about to talk about, specifically around not just virtual focus groups and interviews, but also virtual site visits. Also things like tracking attendance with synchronous learning experiences. So you're going to cover a lot of that and the talking points you've already developed, but just food for thought for you as you go forward.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to switch us into thinking about how we might adapt to some of our evaluation plans, our methods, our methodologies as we move into sort of this virtual context. And one of the first things that I wanted to acknowledge that we've certainly been thinking a lot about here at the Weichert Center is, there's been so much conversation around switching to a virtual program, and there's so many different definitions of what programming looks like nowadays. So I think, as programs and practitioners have shifted to support these new learning environments, we've been talking a lot about virtual programming and how it's currently being delivered in a lot of different modalities within one network than perhaps we've seen in the past. So we're hearing a lot about sort of synchronous learning and asynchronous learning, so that difference between the live, real-time activity implementation versus those that are sort of stored in an online space that people have the opportunity to engage with and at sort of their own pace. But at the same time, we're hearing that there's a number of programs who are compiling websites and resources and just kind of making those supporting materials available for youth and families that they can reach into whenever they need it. And then we're hearing, to meet the needs of those communities and families that don't have access to all of these different technologies that are required to engage in virtual learning. There's a lot of programs that are still kind of creating those, pen and paper activities and booklets that they're sort of physically distributing throughout their community so that young people and families still have learning activities and enrichment activities that they can engage in while they're together. And kind of last but not least, there's certainly a number of programs that are still offering in-person activities to meet those needs of those essential workers. So there's a lot of different types of program settings and modalities that are currently available. And, whereas before, our evaluation and research strategies may have sort of assumed there was kind of one sort of typical or most common way to offer that activity to engage in that in-person program, we too, as researchers and evaluators, we need to expand how we can continue to assess what the needs are now in these different learning settings, what are the experiences that staff and young people and families are reporting as a result of engaging in these different types of modalities that are intended to sort of provide a similar experience or similar outcome, and then certainly be able to identify what is the impact of participating in these different types of programs that are being offered in such different ways within the same network. And so one of the things that's really kind of risen to the surface as we think through all of these is that it's a time to break out of our routines and to leverage all of those different methods that have kind of been in our research or toolkit. So on the screen, kind of what we put together, some of the most common data collection activities and strategies that we commonly use in our different projects. Certainly not an exhaustive list, but even here, just kind of looking at some of the basics, we can start to brainstorm what are some other solutions that we might want to think about in this new environment. So I know we've received a lot of questions ahead of now and even now thinking about, well, how do we track attendance? How do we track engagement? You can even add to that sort of how do you track implementation fidelity? So, with a lot of the different platforms that we're using, whether we're on Zoom or Google Hangout, lots of those have video capabilities or chat boxes. So how might you use, sort of counting heads in videos, just like you would do in a typical classroom to collect attendance? Or maybe you pose a question in a chat and see how many people respond or put in their name. Similar to how Allison opened us up today with, go ahead and update your name on your profile and tell us a little bit about yourself. It's a fun icebreaker to kind of build some community within that setting, and you can also use that as an opportunity to kind of take attendance for who's in your room. There's also lots of other features that you can take available if you're familiar with Kahoot or Poll Everywhere. There's a lot of other softwares that are out there that you can, pose a reflection question at the end of an activity to kind of get feedback on how that experience was, and get youth voice around sort of what they would like to see in future activities, or how they might make applications between what you talked about and other aspects of their life. Thinking about sort of implementation fidelity or even tracking attendance, right? There's all of these different sort of calendar systems that are available. Maybe you create a shared calendar where people kind of post what they did that day or kind of track their weekly or daily activities. And then of course there's good old pen and paper, right? So just like we did kind of in our classrooms where maybe we had a piece of paper where we were tracking attendance or an Excel file that we were filling out as we go, think about different templates that you might be able to create and share with different families. Maybe it's something that you print out and put in those packets that you send home, and just give them an opportunity to share what they engaged in that week, how much time they spent on different activities. So there's lots of different ways, even from an attendance and engagement standpoint, that you can start to play around with features of some of these different softwares, but also just kind of revisit the good old basics for how we collect that information. From a program quality standpoint, which I know is something we talk about every day here at the Weichert Center. This is certainly an opportunity that's been coming up a lot as we talk to different networks, is leveraging those video capabilities, right? So there's an opportunity to record those sessions just like we are recording our conversation now, and you can review it at a later date. You can do that to do that with self-assessment, so that the practitioner themselves has the opportunity to kind of reflect on what they did during that activity, and perhaps they look at a program quality assessment, do a self-assessment to help them plan for the future. Maybe they use that as an opportunity to have a coaching conversation with their supervisor or with some of their colleagues as practitioners are continuing to brainstorm what do the new best practices look like? What does it look like to do kind of high quality engagement in a virtual setting? I think it's important to remember too in this space, and many of you have kind of already brought this up in the comments, that this is really a low stakes moment. So we do need to provide and kind of give everyone grace as we're adapting to sort of this new learning environment. it's an opportunity to kind of reflect with your peers, reflect with your colleagues, kind of what are you seeing, what have you tried, what's working, what's not working, but encourage those conversations among your team, among the program staff as well, to kind of continuously be able to learn from each other, so that there's an opportunity to identify and sort of set new standards for what how program quality might be defined sort of in this new environment. Thinking ahead too, to sort of, if you're looking to capture that experience or those outcomes feedback through your evaluation design. Certainly we've all been doing surveys, and there's still an opportunity to collect some of those, but as many have mentioned, and I think many of us have experienced, our response rates are a little bit lower. So we're seeing a number of people start to shift to focus groups as an opportunity to perhaps have sort of deeper conversations with a fewer number of people, but kind of getting some of that rich information about what that shift is looking like, and kind of how we plan for the future. But similarly, you know, thinking about Zoom, thinking about some of the other platforms that we talked about before, there are lots of polling software. So maybe it's not doing a large survey, maybe it's just asking one question here or there to get some feedback to guide your next steps. This is also a place where you can just think about text messages, right? So we know from some of the Pew Research data that was collected in 2019 that 75% of American households have access to a cell phone, maybe not a smartphone, but definitely a cell phone. And certainly that is different depending on the communities that you're working with. But, you know, when in doubt, 75% of Americans seem to be using text messages. So or have cell phones. So how might you use text messages to kind of send out one question and kind of check in with the youth or the staff or the different stakeholders that you're encouraging to get that feedback from. And then, of course, you know, we mentioned focus groups, we mentioned interviews. We're also hearing a lot about, you know, Zoom fatigue and being on these video meetings all the time. So, you know, pick up the phone. You know, this is an opportunity to have a conversation and just kind of set up different calls with people to get their feedback, hear what's going on. So consider all of these different options as you move through here, as you move through all the different choices that you have to think about data collection. So the next part is thinking about focusing on essential data more often. So one of the things that we're hearing a lot as we talk to different partners is this need to, you know, as Ashley and as Neil have both suggested, you know, there's a real need to sort of pause, revisit your plans, identify sort of what those essential priorities are for your organization, for the work that you're doing in response to how things have changed, how things have shifted, and just come back to kind of a shared consensus of what are those essential priorities that your organization wants to focus on. And so what we're hearing a lot from people too is, you know, honing in on those essential practices, on those essential standards, and then collecting them more often. So whereas before we may have had sort of these large surveys, holistic surveys where we're collecting information about all of these different topics, now's the time to really focus in on the core components of what you offer, the core components of the current experience, and sort of do pulse checks, right? Or do polls on a frequent basis to kind of understand what that experience is like, and to be able to engage in that continuous quality improvement effort to always learn and grow with how the situation is unfolding. Some of the things that have also come up as we've talked to a bunch of different networks is, you know, this is an opportunity for a needs assessment. So as you think about kind of what are some of the priorities to move forward, certainly connecting with each of your different stakeholders, assessing their needs, kind of what they have access to, what challenges, what experiences, what concerns they're having in their home life, and being able to just kind of connect into what their priorities are. It's also an opportunity to then ask questions around sort of readiness, right? So to what extent, you know, as you offer these different types of programs, to what extent are youth, families, staff ready to engage? Are there training opportunities that are needed? Are there, you know, technology softwares or platforms that people don't have access to? Is there a possibility of getting, you know, different devices out to your community? So those are some other things to think about, particularly as you sort of examine the readiness to engage in what types of services you're going to be offering moving forward. kind of coming back to that idea around, what is virtual program quality? What are we learning these days? I think we're all in a moment where we're learning together. And so it's an opportunity to kind of build that consensus. So bring your teams together, have conversations around what those essential priorities are, and kind of reaffirm what are those new operational definitions of that quality standard. So we know from research before this, and I'm sure research that will continue, that this is an opportunity to kind of focus on the bottom of the pyramid, right? Focus on safety, focus on emotional supports, focus on those supportive relationships. One of the phrases that we hear from our partners at Turnaround for Children is this idea of focusing on relationships, routines, and resilience. And so I think that's those 3 R's. That's a nice acronym to kind of keep in mind as we identify what our priorities are moving forward. But again, when you think about program quality and what we have in the PQA, it's not necessarily defined the same way anymore, but it's an opportunity to have a conversation around those same principles, come to sort of a new definition, share some new examples, best practices of what those look like, and then kind of support your colleagues and how you'll go through sort of the plan, assess, improve process with sort of these new standards of quality. And then, of course, kind of one of the last things that Ashley mentioned and I wanted to revisit is, as you think about these adjustments for how you'll pivot, how you make plans moving forward, make sure that you keep in mind data use, right? So if we're in a moment of collecting sort of that essential data more often, then it's really important for us to prioritize that we have an efficient mechanism to use that data so that we can make decisions and kind of pivot as quickly as we need to in response to what we're experiencing. So keep in mind kind of who your different stakeholders are, what type of information resonates with them, and think about those choices too as you make the decisions for what type of data you're going to collect, how you're going to collect it, and kind of the different platforms that you're going to use to get that information together. And then last but not least, of course, when we're moving into a virtual space, we really need to make sure that we prioritize participant safety and data security. So there are perhaps 2 parts of the safety coin that haven't necessarily been experienced by the same person, but they certainly are now. So as you have staff who are engaging with young people, perhaps they're recording videos, perhaps they're taking pictures kind of on a regular basis of what's happening in their programs. It's really important that we keep our sort of the safety and the security protocols behind all of these platforms in mind. So I know certainly Zoom is one that's kind of been in the headlines, but they've provided a number of different details around best practices of how you can kind of maintain security. So that's one example. They tell you to password protect your meetings, and keep that in mind too if you're creating sort of any online chat boards. If you have Facebook groups where you're posting pictures and posting experiences, make sure those are all password protected. You'll also want to think about some of those additional trainings that you might need to offer for online staff. So some of the things that we're hearing from different networks is that a lot of places are having to rethink ratios in those virtual spaces, particularly opportunities where you can create these breakout rooms where you once had the opportunity to maybe be in 2 conversations at once. That's no longer a possibility. So think about having some different staff available to make sure that you're keeping those new ratios in place so that you're protecting youth and making sure that we're keeping them safe in that space. At the same time, be mindful of all of those online spaces where people might be providing comments and connecting with each other in sort of unmonitored ways. Just kind of make sure that you have plans in place to kind of check on those regularly. In addition to checking in with sort of staff and providing some professional development and training there, this is also an opportunity to revisit those group agreements with your young people. So as you have these conversations, as you engage them, if it's in a program setting, if it's in a data collection setting, it's really important to revisit those group agreements when you begin, because young people may not have had the opportunity to talk with their peers and to reflect on kind of what it means to be safe in a virtual space. So I encourage you to kind of kick off all of your projects where you're engaging with young people with an opportunity to get their feedback and have a conversation with them around what group agreements make sense and how can we kind of agree together to sort of protect the confidentiality and protect the space that we're sharing now online. And then last but not least, certainly think about those data security practices. So again, if you are collecting videos, if you are saving chats, you know, this is now an opportunity where, you know, sort of your frontline staff, your frontline data collectors are having sort of greater access to sensitive information and have the opportunity to sort of store it in lots of different places. So you'll have to think through as an organization, as sort of their research partner, you know, what are the data security practices that you need to put in place, both for storing that data, for sharing that data. So if you're going to be passing data back and forth, make sure that you're using safe places, you know, whether it's a password protected Dropbox account or another sort of password protected cloud server. Make sure that you're thinking about those opportunities as well for how you're keeping sort of the transmission of data secure. And then last but not least, certainly think about parent consent and youth assent. So hopefully, as you know, the programs that you're working with, you're going to want to connect with them to make sure what types of consent and assent protocols they've had in place as they've moved to virtual programming. And it might be there might be an opportunity to connect into that to see what other types of conversations or protections do we need to put in place as we move into more of a data collection space. So that's kind of a high-level overview of what we're seeing kind of rise to the surface right now around sort of virtual programming and how people are starting to adapt and make decisions. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Allison, who's going to talk a little bit more about planning for the future and what some of those priorities might be.
Wonderful. Krista, we have a lot of amazing chat happening and dialogue between people, which is wonderful. I ask people to share what's working, successful efforts that are happening with virtual data collection. So you might just want to look through some of that discussion and conversation that's happening. I just want people to be mindful, as Krista just described so articulately, that if you are doing any kind of breakout rooms or other kinds of things, which I think are fabulous for engagement, that there's protection of the right protocols in place. And, you know, if mentors need to be present, or, you know, if parents need to be present, depending on the age of the children, that we really want to keep everyone safe during this time when there might be a lot of feelings of uncertainty, anxiety, and concerns about safety anyway. Okay, and a lot of people are asking, yes, this will be recorded, available, slides available. Krista will explain where we'll all be. I'm not really sure, but I suspect it will be sent out via email afterwards, so she's going to answer those. Great. All right, so I get to do the fun task of closing out the webinar and saying about how to plan for the future. And always fun because I have incredibly articulate and helpful and seasoned presenters who have described a lot of the big points already. So I'm like the icing on the cake. And if you don't hear anything from my talk, you've already heard enough information that is really going to help you moving forward. I just wanted to talk a bit about the framing and the ways that we should be communicating and thinking about terminology, because it's so important as researchers and evaluators and as practitioners in the field. And some things just to say, can you move to the next slide, Krista, please? Thanks. So some things just to say to start is just how to think about what questions and information to prioritize now as we build back better. So instead of thinking about learning loss and summer slides and people that are disengaged and unengaged, can we think about how to build back better and how this future could be brighter and stronger, and how our youth can feel safer and be equipped with a new set of skills, and how our staff, whether that be adult professionals working in youth serving organizations, or whether that be staff in schools, or whether that be people working in community-based centers, are all ready and equipped and feel competent and are ready to partner with youth and are ready to partner with whatever types of populations they serve. Krista, next slide. And so I think I want to leave 3 key ideas for you guys to think about as we think about the future. And that's, first, improve what we need to do now. So a lot of what's been talked about already, when Neil talked about different ways to make sense of missing or partial data, how to pivot or how not to pivot. So, you know, thinking about how can we make the programming and the things that we're doing, the virtual focus groups, etc., as best as they can be, right? And we know things are stressful and things are changing, and so we want to improve what we're currently doing. We also want to think about what information to collect. And so again, lots of different tips have already been shared about what to collect and what kinds of topics. I'll talk a little bit more in a few slides about this too, but also consider about what information we should be collecting around this current COVID time period. So not about the past, not about the future, but about what's happening right now. And the third part is thinking about how to build back better. And so when things reopen, when schools reopen, when programs reopen, how are we in positions in a really good spot? And how do we make our case? And by making our case, I mean, how do we communicate to others, maybe partners we've already had, or new partners like new funders or new school district partners or new community-based organization partners or parents that we haven't reached before, why what we're doing is so critical and important to ensure that youth thrive. Next slide, Krista. And so a lot of you are dear friends and positive youth development researchers, and I'm preaching to the choir, but some of you might not be. And you know, we try to think a lot about the language and the way we talk about youth and young people and you know, at-risk youth and people that are experiencing greater struggles right now because of inequities or other issues that are happening. And so instead of talking about trauma-affected youth or youth that are unable to learn or youth that are falling behind or distracted, withdrawn, disruptive learning that's happening, let's start thinking about how to message in ways that say, if we do X, Y, and Z, and if we continue to provide supports in X, Y, and Z, and continue to train people, and continue to have these linkages and these partnerships and these programs, how can we have youth that are thriving, that are ready to learn, that are engaged, and are focused and are connected to others? This really is a time where we can try to message better and try to connect with people and prioritize the right information. All right, next slide, Krista. And so when I say the right information, obviously that's very specific to what you're doing in your local organization, school district, school, etc. So I'm not going to say there is any one right thing to collect or there is any one right group to collect that information from. But I'm going to suggest some things, some options, and talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons. So a lot of you have already described how you're collecting information from staff, whether that be educators or youth serving professionals. Really a great time to listen and learn from the staff that you work with, that you oversee, that you partner with, etc. There was one question in the chat box that was really interesting. It talked a bit about how over-surveyed the staff are right now and how to deal with that situation. I think it's gonna be more and more important to think about some of the ways to collect information that Krista suggested. So instead of it being another survey that's coming via email, if it's part of a typical staff managee type meeting, if it's part of a typical check-in that you have, an all staff-wide meeting that you typically have, or some kind of training that you have, it feels different. So I really think that if we're overburdening people with surveys, we need to think about why we're asking so many of these questions, and are they repetitive? Are they duplicative? Can we streamline things? Can we ask in a different way or of a different group? Caregivers are another great group to check in with right now. And I love to think that caregivers have time and are easy to reach right now, but some of them are going to be pretty tricky to reach. And so let's think about the best ways and the best strategies to do that, and how to really learn valuable information and how to make it as convenient as possible for people that are managing jobs and childcare and a lot of other stressful things during this time. A lot of people mentioned already in the chat box, there's some great conversations about engaging older youth in different types of virtual programs and virtual data collection activities. So it sounds like people are really already on the right paths to doing that. Again, always keep in mind some of the things Chris talked about with just making sure we're protecting the safety and the rights of all those as research participants and any of this work that we're doing. And then one that I think is really important for the equity conversation that Ashley framed so eloquently in the beginning part is people we haven't reached before. So we are aware that our surveys are sometimes being answered by a certain group of people right now that have the capacity to answer surveys. And so the ones that we aren't reaching, how else can we get their perspective and their input? And what I've been trying to use as a mantra right now to think about the future is what's appropriate, feasible, and respectful, given the COVID situation in your setting and context. And to also feel like you can collect data later on about this time period. So if you have tried in multiple different ways and what you think are the most appropriate strategies to collect data and it's just not working, you feel like you're only getting a certain segment of the population, you're really not getting representative answers, you can ask later on when everyone comes back and things are opened again for them to retrospectively think about things. So there's some somewhat compelling research around the validity or the accuracy of people being able to reflect back on their thoughts and attitudes and beliefs and behaviors in the past. So don't feel like this all has to happen right now. I think it's okay for some of this to happen going forward. So feasible, respectful, and appropriate. It's on the slide right now. Yeah, great. And if you can turn to the next slide, Krista. Okay, so what should we be collecting? Lots of questions coming in and came in before when you registered for the webinar around, I was collecting academic achievement data, or I was collecting attendance data. What do I do now? And I think Krista has highlighted a lot of the different kinds of strategies to doing this, but I'm going to focus a bit about the outcomes or the things that you could collect. So I think it's really important now to check in around social emotional learning skills, to measure conditions for learning and think about pro-social and negative behaviors, and also to think about proactive and preventative approaches. So if you're an organization that works with young people, is there training in place, let's say for mental health for all your staff? Because we know that people, as they do start to come back to programs, might have experienced a lot of anxiety and uncertainty and might need some more support in that area. Is there a way to figure out the partnerships that you develop or new systems that you put in place to refer people to mental health providers, etc.? The social emotional learning skills is a big
I think we lost your sound, Allison. Oh no.
Oh gosh.
Oh man. All right, well, we will connect with Allison and try and let her know that we can't hear her. Oh my goodness. Ashley or Neil, would you guys mind reaching out to Allison and letting her know that her audio is off? And I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead and answer one of the questions, one of the popular questions that kind of came up in the conversation around what's happening with a virtual YPQA. So we are certainly having those conversations a lot right now with our clients, and we're learning a lot about how different networks are engaging in that work. So one of the things that we've been doing is just kind of being thought partners in those conversations. So I think, you know, there's been a number of different ideas that have been popped up here in the chat box. Jocelyn from Sprockets, I think, created or said it really well. This is an opportunity, perhaps as a first step, to start thinking about how you can use that YPQA as a planning tool, right? So kind of going back to some of the comments that I had mentioned in my slides, just the opportunity to take a look at those practices, particularly those ones around emotional safety, around relationships.
I think I left sound back. Sorry, Krista.
Good. Oh,
I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine. I was
Oh,
just
dear.
I was answering the questions around the virtual PQA that came in while
Great.
we were hearing your audio out. So
sorry. Krista,
no,
what was the last thing that you heard?
I think you just started to go into sort of the SEL skills part.
Okay. Yeah. So so these are the 5 collaborative for academic social emotional learning skills that are up on the slide and have to do with self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And sometimes these are burdensome to collect in that a lot of times they're self-report or teacher ratings. They can be done observationally. They can be done through different kinds of apps or technology. And I say that because I think these are really important things to collect, and I think they're really helpful in understanding the quality of the kinds of programs that you're delivering and the different services. But it might not be the case that you try to do this data collection effort right now, and that you try to figure out ways to collect this information in the fall or going forward. But there's lots of innovative things happening, so just explore some of these ideas. AIR is really focused a lot on the conditions for learning, and others have too, on those more like environment kinds of features that you have in schools or in programs, etc. And Some of those have to do with the youth feeling physically, emotionally safe, creating opportunities for youth engagement, making sure it's rigorous, like the content you're providing is challenging them, is really meeting their needs and is appropriate, but is pushing them, and isn't below their levels. And then really thinking about things like prosocial and negative behaviors. So obviously we're not collecting like school record attendance data right now, but that doesn't mean you can't collect information about attendance in some of your virtual programs in space. And you can't stop collecting things like people's engagement in leadership opportunities in that youth space. So for example, you could have youth be leading some of the parts of the programs you're doing in your online spaces. You could have people really continue to document or describe positive contributions they're making, like relationships with others or ways they're civically engaged or like-minded, and that I shift again from all being about negative outcomes and areas to being more about positive things. The last part is just about documenting that proactive preventative approaches, and I think I touched on that before. Krista, you heard that content before, right? Okay, so I think I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time to the next slide. So I just want to close a little bit with this time of listening and learning. I have heard so many partners that I work with always say, I wish I just had time to sit and reflect on the data I have, or to sit and think about where we are right now and what should we do going forward. And so I think you've heard this message throughout the webinar today, but this really is a time to connect and to think and to do some action planning, to figure out what makes sense for right now, what makes sense for when you come back, and how can we, shape the message and shape the dialogue, and how can we disseminate what we already know our findings, and then how can we figure out what we really want to be saying in the future. And the last slide here just is something just to keep in mind, that I think it's so important and so wonderful how creative and innovative everyone is being. And I really want to push you and continue to encourage you to say and think of new ways to do things as we face this virtual space for the first time. But I don't want to suggest reinventing the wheel. I don't want to suggest doing things that are so outside someone's wheel box that they feel so incompetent or unconfident in doing them and just don't have the skills or the technology or whatever else they need to do them well, and that they fall flat. And so I think a lot of what we already know about like program quality in person relates to program quality online. We really are so important about connecting with young people, having those relationships and having those environments, whether that be an online learning space or an in-person learning space. It's really about setting up those types of supportive environments that help people to learn and thrive. And I think a lot of us want to find the new next magic bullet thing to do right now, and there just isn't that answer. And so what there is instead is to reflect on what's been working well for you and what still makes sense to do, and then what can we do moving forward, and what is really the best and most thoughtful approach given what everyone is facing right now and what we think the reality will be when we come back. Krista, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks for rolling with it, even
Sorry
though
about that.
technology didn't work with us for a minute. I am gonna kind of wrap up kind of what I was saying around the question on the virtual PQA. I know that was one of the questions that kind of came in, and then I've definitely taken stock of a few other common questions that I think would be great for the whole group to address. But just to kind of pick back up on the virtual PQA. So I think again, what Allison just spoke to and some of the comments that have been shared in the box, I think it's definitely a time to take a look at those program quality standards and use it as a planning tool, right? Have conversations with your staff, have conversations with your young people around kind of what does a high quality program look like, feel like, sound like when you're in these new virtual settings. And have conversations, build sort of a shared consensus with your team about sort of both what are the priority standards that you really want to focus on, because again, maybe now is not the time to do a full PQA, maybe it's time to just sort of focus on the safe environment or the supportive environment aspect. aspects of your program quality, but have conversations with your staff, build consensus around what those priorities are, and kind of check in on them frequently. You know, one of the other things that's really coming out as a big part of this conversation is that this is sort of a low stakes moment. We are all in the process of evolving our practice of learning new standards, learning new tricks to kind of how we engage in sort of online activities and how we provide sort of high quality learning experiences for young people. And so it's an opportunity to use that tool to have conversations, engage in some coaching, engage in sort of more collaborative conversations with the rest of your team to come to consensus around what are those priorities, what do those look like, and then from there you can kind of move more into a space of kind of sharing that knowledge more broadly and having sort of whole staff conversations around sort of establishing kind of new safety protocols or new safety practices that you want to be mindful of. I know at Weikert we are certainly having conversations all the time with our different partners who are starting to think about this work, and we're moving in a direction of hoping to pull a number of partners together to kind of engage in this conversation at a higher level and be able to kind of share those learnings across networks with each other. So definitely stay tuned. Keep an eye on your email. I know we'll be pulling that together here in the next few months as we continue to have conversations and figure out kind of what are those best practices, what's working. So I think that's where we're at with that. And please continue to share some of your great examples about how you are navigating that space in your own work. One of the other questions that I've seen pop up a lot in the chat box that I think Allison you could speak to, and I'm sure most of us could too, is a question around resources. So in particular, you know, as we're shifting to a real focus on SEL measurement, and as we're shifting to come up with new questions, new ideas, sort of measure and understand the reactions to COVID-19, where are you guys finding different resources, or where would you recommend people start to look to pull some of those ideas from to start to create sort of these new measures or new questions?
Yeah, there's so many. Let me compile a few that are great to share broadly. There's a few compendiums is what I would suggest. So not just like one saying that's the blanket one for you, but there's some good like tool sorters or tool finders. I think there's one developed by Rand and one developed by Castle. I think one developed by Clark McCowan and his shop. So a few different resources I can put in the chat box and definitely send up in the follow-up materials, but will really help you think through what your needs are and then what your population is and what the best tool might be given that. I also think Wallace did a good compendium for more of the out-of-school time resources, I'm pretty sure, but I could be misspeaking on that one.
I'll also add that I have seen Every Hour Counts has pulled together a really great resource of different surveys that youth organizations have been kind of putting out into their network to kind of take a look at the response to COVID-19, kind of how staff are responding, how families are responding. So I would definitely check out Every Hour Counts as a great resource to kind of look at some COVID-19 specific measures that you might be interested in. And we'll definitely be adding that to our resource list that we'll share out in an email as well. I'm curious, Neil or Ashley, if there are other measures or places where you go to think through how you manage this pivot right now. What other resources are you using?
Well, in our case, I know some of the things we're trying to do is to build off things that we've also used in the past. We recently completed a study where we use the experience sampling method to try to collect some more immediate engagement data. So the focus here is really on collecting a very small number of questions that get at the issue of engagement in a given moment, how interested, how engaged, how challenged, what their affective state is. And we've had a lot of luck not only in being able to get these things collected within a couple of minutes, but they also can be very useful in connecting to other types of outcomes we're interested in. So they do seem to be predictive of things, some of the changes that we would expect to see in participation. So there are some examples of these more immediate engagement types of surveys that can be done relatively quickly, kind of measuring kind of some key dimensions. that we're particularly interested, that we found a lot of value in, for sure. A lot of things you've already mentioned too, in terms of the compendiums, in terms of measures. I think those are definitely some of the places that we would focus on, or I would recommend, from a measure and methodological standpoint. Trying to see. I don't know, Ashley, is there anything you would want to add to that?
I don't think so. I think that the three of you are probably more familiar with those resources than me.
There's also some questions in the chat. There's a lot of questions about measurement in the chat, and a lot of those we've talked about. One interesting kind of wrinkle around kind of doing things virtual was this whole idea of doing quality improvement processes in a virtual format. So not so much the measurement of quality, but engaging in the work of quality improvement in a virtual way, and somebody kind of musing about how can they do that in a way that's effective. I'm not sure if there's anything that the Weicker team has thought about in that regard, or if we have any responses around. Our processes are shifting, right? A lot of things that we would do in person around quality improvement and how we go through those processes are going to be different. So I'm wondering if we have any advice for people who are trying to do that in a social distancing kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, some of the initial ideas that have bubbled to the top in conversations we've had the past few weeks really comes back to the idea of collecting sort of the essential data more often, and really focusing on use. So, you know, typically, a lot of networks kind of engage in quality improvement cycles and think of them as sort of a year-long process. And we're certainly in a moment right now where our learning environments and our options and our resources are changing on a very frequent basis. So it's certainly the opportunity to think more about rapid cycles of improvement. So again, kind of coming back to that measurement piece, what are the essential questions that you need to ask? How can you ask those questions not only more frequently, but in a way that allows you to look at that data quickly so that you can engage in conversation. So, you know, for example, if you set up sort of weekly staff check-ins or, you know, weekly staff meetings, is there some, you know, a poll or a pulse check that you could ask all of your staff to do at the end of a program that would easily feed in and kind of be ready to debrief at your next meeting? So I think kind of what we're hearing about a lot is just thinking about quicker, sort of quicker improvement cycles, and really honing in on what are the essential data points. And it may be, you know, this week we focus on this practice and really try and understand it, and next week we focus on this one practice and really try and understand it. But it's really a time to kind of be more bite-sized, I guess, in our approach to quality improvement, just given that everything is changing so rapidly. I'm not sure. I know Neil and Allison, you both do quality work with other networks as well. I'm wondering what you're learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think we're trying to figure out how we can adjust, you know, with those procedures as well, and encourage the type of discussions in a remote format. And I think there's a lot of kind of working independently through processes and then coming together to have those discussions in a way. So working through tools, doing self-assessment, self-reflection individually, and then coming together in Zoom meetings and having conversations about what those things mean for practices. Some of that has seemed to be effective as well. And we're in the process too of trying to figure out how we're going to pivot, especially as we move into the next year in terms of those types of supports. The other thing that we've been trying to encourage people to think about, again, is elevating those practices that are embedded in the quality frameworks and the quality tools that may be especially aligned with what students are going to be experiencing in the COVID-19 world. Which of those things might be more important and require more thought about how to adopt into practice as a consequence. And so I'm trying to shift that orientation a little bit in terms of being more targeted in relation to those practices. And in some respects, that can actually, I think, facilitate some of the conversations, because there's I think a lot of aha moments that says this stuff is particularly important now than it ever has been, and we really need to focus in these areas in order to be responsive to the needs of our students.
I mean, I think too, one thing that comes to mind is just my mantra about building capacity to do evaluation, to do data collection, everything of your own staff, because it just shows how important it is to have that kind of experience and competencies in-house, and that, you know, it's really critical to have wonderful partners, etc. But the extent to which you can help staff reflect, use data, learn from it, make decisions based off of it is just key. And I think this is like a really important time for you know, that to continue to happen, or, you know, to that kind of idea about the capacity building around understanding data and everything to continue.
Very good.
I know I saw a few questions pop up too around asynchronous learning and how do you do evaluation in that space. I have certainly thought about it a little bit and kind of engaged with it in a couple different spaces, and you know, I'll just say that the ideas that I've tried that are working, they're not great, but it's a step forward. Is just kind of connecting into those asynchronous places and trying to find either sort of create reflection worksheets or sort of assignments that people have to respond to kind of give me a sense of to what extent they paid attention or sort of engaged in the whole activity. Perhaps it's sort of posting, you know, asking everyone to provide a comment under the video and kind of taking stock of what questions were there. Those are some ways that I've started to think about asynchronous learning opportunities and how to sort of track attendance or engagement as kind of creating some activity that requires all participants to sort of react or give feedback to what that opportunity was. That's one thing I'm trying or thinking about. Now, I'm not sure if any others have tried that space yet.
I think that's great. I think too, we heard on a wonderful webinar last week just about how people are coming back together to show like products they did. You know, let's say it was an activity they did and then they come back and they can show what's been developed, or they can post it like a recording, or they can do a quick picture of it, or they can do something like that to kind of have a sense. I think too that idea about attendance or engagement are a little bit different, right? So do they show up versus like, did they think it was useful, meaningful, valuable? Did they learn something from it? Are they doing something with it? And you know, that's a little bit harder to get at than did they actually complete like an assignment, for example.
Great. Well, I think we are officially out of time. We have hit our 3:30 time limit for today. I want to thank everyone for showing up and asking such wonderful questions, both before, during the registration process, and today in the chat box. You certainly shared a list of wonderful resources that we're going to pull together and make into a resource page that we'll share out with everyone here in the next week, along with the recording of the webinar as well as the slides. So you're welcome to kind of share that with other people in your networks who may benefit or from the conversation or wrestling with some of the same decision points right now. And I want to give a huge thank you to my co-panelists, Allison, Ashley, and Neil. Thank you so much for partnering together to kind of reflect on what our collective experiences are in this space. I hope it's been useful. I know it's certainly been useful to me. I'm walking away with a number of new ideas. But thank you all for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to connect with you and to see you in the chat box. And we will be in touch soon. We hope to connect with you here in the near future. Good luck in all of your evaluations and projects. Thank you.